It amazes us that a crew flying something like an A320 can be so off on their procedures that they managed to touch the runway without noticing the gear wasn't down. They should have had at least 2 opportunities to drop the gear or verify it, shouldn't they? On May 22, 2020, Pakistan International Airlines Flight 8303 crashed into an area packed with houses in Karachi, Pakistan. 97 of the 99 aboard were killed and 1 on the ground. Only 2 survivors miraculously escaped the burning rubble. From being the airlines that helped the great Emirates Airlines to fly, to being one of the most avoided airlines of Pakistan today, how did PIA gain its reputation as a ticking time bomb? The pilots seemed to be not all there that day from the get-go when they missed their top of descent from 10K, and they did the equivalent of what people do when they are about to miss their exit on a highway from 3 lanes over. First mistake was made at 10,000 feet, but everything after that was to cover that mistake, unfortunately. Let's start with the beginning. It has almost been 4 years since the ill-fated crash of PIA Flight 8303. On May 22, 2020, a PIA flight was ready for a standard flight from Lahore to Karachi in Pakistan. Only it wasn't so standard. For one thing, it took place during the COVID-19 lockdowns. The flight was the first after a 2-month suspension due to the pandemic. Pakistan had allowed domestic flights to resume, following suspension during the COVID-19 pandemic, 6 days earlier on the 16th of May. Another thing was that it took place during the month of Ramadan. During this month, Muslims observe a strict fast from dawn until sunset. Fasting can actually be just as risky as alcohol consumption for pilots, and PIA had instructed their pilots to not fast. PIA has barred its pilots and flight attendants from fasting during the ongoing holy month on their on-flight duty days, citing a medical recommendation which says a person faces dehydration and issues of laziness and sleep while observing a fast. However, the pilots were still fasting on this flight. The flight crew consisted of 58-year-old Captain Sajjad Gul, who had over 17,000 hours of flying experience, and 33-year-old First Officer Usman Azam, who had been flying with PIA for 10 years, but had only about 2,100 total hours, mostly on the A320. For this flight, the first officer was the one actually flying, and the captain was monitoring the flight. Now, Captain Gul had actually failed his psychological test when he wanted to become a PIA pilot. His psychologist had said he was bossy, firm, dominant, and overbearing, with below-average intelligence, which is a terrible combination for a pilot. He also had low mechanical comprehension, and his level of stress tolerance was also quite inadequate. No one like that should ever become a pilot, so how did he? He instead asked for a second opinion from 5 other psychiatrists, who all gave him a green light to continue as a cadet. The problem for him, though, was that the PIA had stopped allowing second opinions at that point. So he complained to the federal ombudsman, and the ombudsman actually sided with him, and he was therefore allowed to start his training. The pilot wasn't just a captain now, he was also a standards inspector, which meant he was inspecting the training of other pilots. How he got there, we have no idea, especially considering the fact that this wasn't his first flight where he ignored standard protocols. The plane took off at 13:05. The weather that day was clear, and the Airbus A320 provided for the trip was in good working order. Certainly there was nothing to indicate that risk was above baseline levels for any reason other than the general pandemic disruption. The flight reached its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet, and the atmosphere in the cockpit was normal too. The pilots were engaged in a lengthy and animated discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was interrupted only by radio calls and other routine events. At 14:15, after crossing Nawabshah, the crew requested clearance to begin their descent, and the Karachi area controller cleared them to descend to 10,000 feet. The lack of any unusual features in the approach procedure and the perfectly clear weather, the descent and landing ought to have been smooth sailing. Unfortunately, for several frankly boneheaded reasons, events would soon go off the rails anyway. The pilots had ignored warnings from air traffic control about the height and speed of the aircraft on approach. At 14:30, the plane was 15 nautical miles from Karachi, at Makli, flying at an altitude of 10,000 feet instead of the recommended 7,000 feet. The pilot had been warned 4 times by the air traffic controller before landing that the plane was at extraordinary altitude. When ATC issued its first warning to reduce altitude instead of descending, one of the pilots responded by saying that he was satisfied with the descent profile. When only 10 nautical miles were left from the airport, the aircraft was at an altitude of 7,000 feet instead of 3,000 feet. That's more than double the altitude they should have been at. ATC issued a second instruction to turn to descend. One of the pilots responded again by stating that he was satisfied and able to handle the situation and that he was prepared for landing. ATC advised orbits for the aircraft in order to re-establish on the profile, but this was not performed. The aircraft was approximately 4,000 feet above the glide slope for runway 25L, with this difference reducing, whilst ATC repeatedly attempted to request the flight crew discontinue the approach. The captain could be heard saying, "He will be surprised that we have done this," likely referring to the controller, and this indicates that he was actually quite pleased with himself and where the aircraft now was, like if this was something to be proud of. However, the fifth time the traffic controller allowed the plane's landing. The pilots descended very late and were at a very high speed in their initial approach, which leads to one question: why in the world were they so desperate to get down on the ground on their first approach? It's quite common to go around and try again if an approach is unstable, and it doesn't take a lot of time either. You can hear that alarm in the ATC recording when the pilot is talking. There's a beeping noise in the background. There are also flashing lights on the displays. There are two pilots. How could both of them miss something so crucial? The two pilots were not focused as they made the first landing attempt without opening the landing gears, during which its engines struck the runway and caught fire. The air traffic controller did not inform the pilots about the engine's fire. The system that provided lubricant oil to both engines went out of order after the engine thudded the runway, stopping both engines at the same time. The engines run the generators which provide electric power to the plane. Without the engines, there was no power. The plane's last 4-minute data could not be recorded as engine failure cut the electricity supply. The plane's ram air turbine was deployed, which supplies power to the airplane's control systems when both engines have failed, and without the auxiliary power unit running. When the pilot went around, it is believed damage had already been caused to both engines from this contact, leading to engine failure after the go-around. This made it impossible for the aircraft to maintain altitude, causing it to crash during its return to the airfield. There's CCTV footage of the crash and the immediate few seconds before it where it appears the landing gear is deployed and all the wheels seem to be down. So did the landing gear fail the first time they attempted to land but worked okay the second time around? How is that possible? Especially considering both the engines were damaged and all control systems were out. The landing gear did lower during the first landing but was pulled back up, and no one notified the other about this, resulting in a belly landing. And then, the takeoff go-around couldn't be initiated properly due to loss of both, left first, right soon after, engines. The senior co-pilot had a history of taking such dangerous decisions during previous flights where it all paid off, and this was confirmed through analysis of his previous flights. But since the airline wasn't doing its job of analyzing data of previous flights for quality improvements and detect protocol breakdowns, this was never caught. The pilot, who was a junior in this case, was an extremely mediocre pilot, barely making it through his exams and evaluations, and probably didn't speak up to point errors because of the culture to not point out elders' mistakes. The CCTV footage also shows the plane's nose is up as is standard while landing, but there doesn't seem to be any attempt to try and steer the plane clear of the populated area it was coming down on. Doesn't the ram air turbine support minimal control of the pitch and yaw? Yes, there have been instances before where all engines were down, but the plane was still controllable. One of the two survivors said they landed. It was rumbling like crazy, and then they took off again. Video footage of the crash scene showed emergency teams trying to reach the scene amid the rubble, clouds of black smoke and flames in the background. The crash caused many people and journalists to look into the training and licensing of Pakistan's commercial pilots. They found out that a lot of them were issued their license and training during Pakistan's holidays and weekends, days that most of those departments would not be open. This was a horrifying discovery. Pilots are entrusted with the lives of hundreds every day, and for them to ignore standard procedures so casually is infuriating. PIA wasn't originally like this. In the 1960s, PIA was one of the most high-standard airlines of all time, pretty much like the Emirates of that time. The airline gave rise to most of the airlines in the Middle East like Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar Airways by leasing some of its aircraft to that airline. Now, due to the surge of corruption in the country, the airline has become easily one of the worst and least safe. It's a shame, really. The airline equivalent of you either die a hero or live long enough to become the villain yourself.